There are people who, as young children, will be forever surgically mutilated and altered, and their lives will never be the same. There are people who have taken an oath as physicians, the Hippocratic Oath, who are violating it every day by going ahead and making money off of this fake ideology. I think that for those of us who have the ability to do some investigation and do a little bit of work here and there and don't do it, it's a shame, because it really is one of the pressing issues. I hear all the time from critics of mine, why are you spending time on trans? It's such a small issue. I don't agree with that. And for those people that it does affect, it's life-altering, life-changing.
Yeah, I've faced that many times. Why do you care? Why are you so obsessed with it? And for me, it's the complete opposite. Why don't you care?
It needs a serious reporter to do this work. We've been waiting for a serious reporter to do it, and it feels like we've got a live one here. So we have to land this big fish.
Hi, Stella. Hi, Mia. How are you?
Hi. I'm well. How are
We
you?
have so much to get through. I'm like, how are we going to get through all this?
You know, the great thing is one of the things that I like about the podcast you're doing is that it's really truly a conversation. So you take people. Mia's always doing her extensive research. I think, oh my God, you actually have to remember everything you've done, because she's like the area, right? And then Stella's like, it's intuitive to you. And then occasionally you'll get something, like the Francis podcast, which is fantastic only because it plays out in real time. And what I like about it is, for those of us who are into the field or look at it or study it or whatever else, our brains are working the same way your brains would be working. You're obviously doing the podcast and asking the questions, but then I'm thinking to myself, gee, what would I be doing next? What would I be asking? How would that left turn, that detour be handled? And I think it's fantastic. And then, the follow-up conversation you had once in discussing it and how that worked was great. So I come here as sort of a fan. Trisha, my other half, is over on the side. And
Thank you, Trisha.
we watch you together and then comment and talk to each other. So anyway, it's very nice to be here.
Oh, wow.
Sounds
Well,
like me.
you've made my day, because I know and I think Mia too, we really regard your work. It's extraordinarily important to have investigative reporters, because there isn't very many of them, as far as I can see. Not many good ones.
Well, but you say something very interesting, which is there could be more, there should be more, just solid reporters and journalists covering this subject. And for some, it's like a third rail. They avoid it because they worry about the consequences in their career, and they think, I wonder if I write that, by the way, the next time I submit. Look, I thought about this early on when I was doing the first works about puberty blockers for that. I mean, this is how insane it gets. I would think, I wonder if I write that story for the Wall Street Journal about the dangers of puberty blockers. The next time I submit an op-ed to the New York Times, somebody from the Times is going to look at that and say, well, we don't want Posner writing anything for us because he's gender critical. He's far out there. He must be transphobic. Every time I repost something from J.K. Rowling and say, oh, with enthusiasm, this is just clear common sense. And I do think that I know this is a bit of a detour that I haven't actually discussed, but I had submitted maybe a year ago, a extensive proposal to my longtime New York agent about what I call the money in the trans industry at that time.
Wow.
Bring the money. You say what?
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
I have a what's the word? A second reason to invite you on, and that was to convince you to write that book. It sounds like you're ahead of me.
I'll tell you. So the long and short of it is, they were enthusiastic initially, and then they passed it around the agency, and then they came back and said, "Oh, it's just one-sided. This is just one side. You've got to talk about all the good stories about people who are born in the wrong body, who have lived a fulfilling life and the benefits of it and everything else. And they wanted a different book, not that book. They are reluctant to get involved in what they view as taking a side. And it's really the most frustrating part to me is it's not taking a side at all. As a matter of fact, what I say and what I have said in the proposal is I've got a year or year and a half of work ahead of me. I don't know the story yet. I know what the outlines of the story are so far, the great work that's been done by Jennifer Bilek, by so many other people. It's there. But now what I'd like to do is go ahead and really have the backing of a publisher to say, go ahead and spend the next year to 18 months getting the rest of the story. And maybe the story sets our hair on fire, and maybe we don't know what it is until you get it. But they don't want to do that. And that's sort of the way I've always done journalism. I've come up with a subject, whether it's the Vatican or whether it's Saudi Arabia or an assassination, and say, here's what I know. Now will you let me go and find out the rest of the story? And I promise to return with a manuscript that will be good. And that's does not seem possible through just a bundle of different traditional publishing houses. So that's where it is right now. And every time I see by the way, a book like Abigail Schreier's fantastic book, every time a book does come out that is able to tackle the subject, and she had gone to an alternative publisher essentially for that book, and was still able to. She had to fight to get the coverage. Was just relegated to sort of gender critical press and some conservative outlets, and that was it. And I find that when you said before, Stella, sorry for the very long diversion when you said to journalists, you're an investigative journalist doing this. I wish more were. I wish more were as well. But I think that a lot aren't because they're just afraid of the consequences. It did become, as Tricia said from the background, it's become political. So that if I say to somebody who doesn't know the field very well at all, just a lay person, I stop and I get a discussion, run into somebody on the street I haven't seen in a year. We talk about grocery prices and the war in Ukraine, and then we get around somehow to transfer over to men and women's sports. Might come up because I tend to raise it. And the minute they say you're sort of against that, then they say you're a Trumpster.
Yeah.
I say, no. What does that mean? I mean, you saw recently after the Supreme Court ruling in the UK, I would see people say to J.K. Rowling online, oh, so aren't you proud that you agree with Trump? She would say, I don't at all. But if on that one issue we cross paths, that's fine. I'll keep that position. But it's politics as well. So people do judge that.
Yeah, it does it needs a serious reporter to do this work. We've been waiting for a serious reporter to do it, and it feels like we've got a live one here, so we have to land this big fish. I used to follow Jennifer Bilek's work, and I really appreciated it for myself. And it's been, I suppose, a niggle for me, and it's not necessarily for anybody else. But I suppose we started GenSpect on no money. Literally, it was completely voluntary, and we've worked so hard, and in a way we kind of got, I suppose we irritated people because Alistair did some brilliant work and made our website look shiny, so people thought that we might have had money behind us. But I thought Jennifer Bilek's work was brilliant, and I wanted her to come on our podcast. I really wanted to kind of discuss everything because I thought it was so important. Somebody's following the money, and somebody is really, really bringing out some really important work that I really wanted to kind of expand and explore, and somebody really go for it. And so I was delighted when I saw yourself, Gerald, working at it, because I thought this is a credible source. Because sadly for me, maybe not for anybody else here, but certainly for me, I felt Jennifer beclowned herself because she suddenly swerved on GenSpect and decided that we were somehow working hand in hand with WPATH, which frankly is farcical, and that we wanted to trans kids, which is, I think, either insane or incredibly stupid. I'm not sure which it is. and that we were actually well funded when, it's very, very easy to check the funding of GenSpec. We're an Irish company. It costs about a fiver. It's easily checked. So somebody like Jennifer deciding to write a book and putting in a whole chapter around GenSpec and not bothering to check our finances and not bothering to check our website shows to me a lack of diligence that I felt, well, I can no longer really take seriously her other work. Sadly, because I really liked it until then, I just felt I've lost complete faith in her work.
It is really unfortunate because there's nothing worse than if you have a movement of people who, let's say, use the term gender critical. We're all doing different things. It's sort of united in taking part this fake, dangerous theory that exists. Then all of a sudden you get splits like that, and where somebody's attacking somebody else without any basis. I can tell you this, I do my own work. I don't just jump on a podcast, but not just that. GenSpec is one of my sources that I go to, and so I understand that. Yeah, no, I mean that because you just often, you have people on, I learn from them, I've learned, I can't tell you about how many times with the detransitioner that I've learned things from being on GenSpec. I know the work that you do. And this is really, it's hard work that is not, you're not doing it for the money. You're not doing it for the fame and glory. You're doing it because you really think you can make a difference. And I think you are. And that's unfortunate that happened because it's pretty unnecessary.
I'd like to add, Stella, I think it's all your fault because you are too impressive. You achieve too much. I don't know how you do, but you achieve so much on a shoestring, and it makes us look like we have billions of dollars when we don't.
Oh, that's very nice.
Stella, what you said, I wish there were more investigative journalists covering this subject. It needs to be done. I think a lot of people are afraid of touching it because it's sort of like a third rail of journalism. They're afraid that if they do it, they won't be able to get published by newspapers and other places, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others for op-eds. And you just don't know. I mean, recently I've been talking. This is all not public information, but it is now, and happy to have it. I was talking to the New York Times about doing an op-ed on the Kennedy assassination when the documents were coming out. We went back and forth, and for every 7 or 8 ideas that I pitched to a newspaper as an op-ed, one gets through. Most of the time they say no, they aren't interested, it's not on their radar, there's somebody up on the ladder. But this time when they said no, I was wondering it was because I just had a series of material on about trans, recently on Twitter and that. You sort of think, I wonder if somebody there said, we're just not going to put it on. It is the way it is. And I think for those of us who decide to look into the field, you realize that if there's a price to pay, so be it. This story is too important because we're not just talking about some theoretical issue of whether a condition should be listed in the DSM or not. There are lives affected here. There are people who, as young children, will be forever surgically mutilated and altered, and their lives will never be the same. There are people who have taken an oath as physicians, the Hippocratic Oath, who are violating it every day by going ahead and making money off of this fake ideology. And I think that for those of us who have the ability to do some investigation and do a little bit of work here and there and don't do it, it's a shame because it really is one of the pressing issues. I hear all the time from critics of mine, why are you spending time on trans? It's such a small issue. There's such important issues out there. Constitutional crisis. There's the war in Ukraine. What's happening in the Middle East? Why aren't you focusing on the big issues today? This affects only a few people. And I think, oh my goodness, I don't agree with that. And for those people that it does affect, it's life altering, life changing. I don't think we have any magic wand, but what you're doing, what I'm trying to do in coverage and news, hopefully will make a difference in the long run.
Yeah, I've faced that many times. Why do you care? Why are you so obsessed with it? And for me, it's the complete opposite. Why don't you care? Why this is one of the maddest things that has ever happened in human history. And it affects all of us. It's not like it just affects a tiny number of people who are being harmed in gender clinics. we all have to live in the insane world where men are women, women are men can be lesbians, and everyone's speech is controlled. It literally affects everyone. Why don't you care? It's always my response.
It is very interesting, Mia, when you say that, because in conversations I have with friends of ours, we have a lot of friends growing up in San Francisco, living in New York City, and now living in Miami Beach. We have a lot of gay friends. And some of them are attuned to the dangers of having attached the T to the LGB and what it means, but others reflexively, almost like an automatic response, believe that the trans community must be a marginalized community and that by criticizing them, you're punching down. And there's a desire as a civil rights to sort of defend it. People fought for me, people will say for marriage and for other rights and this, so therefore I'm going to fight for trans. And I have a discussion often in which I try to explain this to Andrew Sullivan and others who are gay writers who explain still brilliantly, it's transing away the gay to the extent that you are taking often children who the studies show, if you were not rushing them into the medical pipeline with hormones and then surgery, if they had the opportunity for some, watchful period, they would, in fact, a vast majority of them just stay in their unmutilated bodies and be gay. They would, in fact, just be gay children, boys and girls. And instead, they're being sort of forced into this false choice that there is another gender that they can change into. And in that sense, it has a very anti-gay element to trans, but it isn't always seen as that, I think, by LGBT activists.
I wonder, could I ask you, if you were just to think of our listeners who don't know you and don't know your background, could you give a kind of a quick snapshot of, first of all, how much investigative reporting you've done, and where you've landed, how you landed into the trans issue, and what you've garnered so far? Like, what sort of information have you? Because I would think that you have more than most people on this particular issue, which is the following the money.
So I used to be, it seems like another lifetime, an attorney, and I spent some time in the early 80s donating my time to a group of Holocaust survivors, twin children at the time, who'd been experimented on by Dr. Joseph Mengele. And they wanted to sue the German government to get money to pay for the cost of their medical expenses just to cover the pain of what he had done to them. And so I thought, gee, that's a great idea. I'll represent them. Little did I know that it would become an obsession of mine for 3 or 4 years. And we did find nearly 100 of the children still alive of Mengele's experiments. We sued Germany. We got thrown out of court. And I had these 25,000 pages of documents. And together with the British journalist, John Ware, put together a biography. We donated some of the proceeds back to the survivors. And I loved the process of doing the book. It was great. And I was with Tricia. We were together then. We've been together 45 years. And I sort of said, maybe, give up the law and let's do book projects. And she thought that was a great idea. I had the right partner, thank goodness. And the next year we were off in Southeast Asia looking into heroin gangs. That was the next book on the international heroin gangs. And over time, I, instead of staying in one subject, like to switch subjects. I spend a year or two, or sometimes on and off for 9, be on a particular subject, get a level of expertise that I feel absolutely confident in writing and talking about it and finding something new. And then I like to move on to a subject about which I know nothing, which there are a ton of those, and start to recreate the wheel from the ground up. So a lot of investigative writers like to stay in the same field. They write about intelligence work, they write about medicine. They stay in that field. I like moving around. So we've, over time, covered everything from political assassinations to Holocaust stories to books on Saudi Arabia to 9/11 to the finances of the Vatican and to the pharma industry. And the pharma industry is what was the beginning of the work into trans. Trans is not in the book on pharma, but learning about the pharmaceutical industry and how they love nothing more. What is the holy grail in the drug industry is let's get a client early. Childhood's fantastic, and keep them a patient for life. Wow, I wonder where that happens. Certainly happens with trans, with the need for, forget about the need for, if you've had surgery for dilation, but for hormones, for everything else, you have essentially created a patient for life. But what had happened is I had a chapter in which I talked about in America, doctors are given the right, it was passed in 1938, to take a drug that's approved by our Food and Drug Administration for a specific purpose. The drugs go through these clinical trials. And then the doctor can prescribe, he or she can prescribe the medicine for any other condition that they deem necessary. It's called off-label dispensing. And in 1938, when that was passed, there were literally a couple of dozen drugs. So it's not that difficult to figure out. You had a handful of antibiotics and diabetes drugs, insulin, and that. Now you have several thousand drugs. Doctors don't have a specialty in it, but they're able to take a drug and use it off-label. We had, Tricia and me, in doing the research for pharma, and we didn't have time to include it, a nurse who'd gotten hold of us, who had told us about the fact that this gender clinic in the Midwest, they were prescribing Abavis Lupron off-label as a puberty blocker. And the pharma ended up as 800 pages anyway. That did not make it in. But afterwards, it was one of the things that I wanted to follow up with. And then Tricia, who watches YouTube and is sort of the one who calls me in and says, you've got to watch this. And then I say, Tricia, I don't have time. And then she said, no, you've got to watch this. Was watching this series by this place called GenSpec. She was on it like a long time ago. And she would call me and say, you've just got to watch this. And I say, oh, Trish, I'm just not interested right now. And then I'd start to get hooked, and then I'd be there standing there, and then I'd sit down and watch it. And so it was really GenSpec and the work from pharma that made me want to start to look into it. And the first real deep dive was puberty blockers. That was submitted as a 3,000 or 4,000 word article to a few magazines, all of who passed. Much to my disdain, that's the way it works in journalism.
What year was this?
This was in 2023,
Oh,
believe it or not. And finally, the Wall Street Journal,
yeah.
I sent it in, and they said, let's do it as an op-ed. And it turned out to be only 700 words or 800 words, so a fair amount was cut out. But it was great. At least was the ability to do it. And then since then, I've been doing what I can. But often, I did a long piece called Who Put the Kids in Charge? That's sort of the impossibility of getting consent from a child and how it developed over time with the DSM and with gender activists and trans activists, that we ended up believing that children should have the right to say what they needed to do in this field. And that piece I submitted to just about every place that I could think of, and nobody even ran it as an op-ed, so it ended up on a Substack. So I did a Substack. Substack is my place of last resort. I have a small Substack, 10,000 subscribers, but it ends up at least being published. But the frustration, people should not think who are listening that those of us, even with published history, so I have 13 books, 4 New York Times bestsellers, a finalist for the Pulitzer, but I get rejected all the time on stories, not just on trans, but on other stories. That's the nature of the business. If you don't like getting rejection letters as a freelance writer, you shouldn't be in this business. That I understand. I do think that trans makes it even a higher hurdle, and that many of the things that I would like to write about, I can't find an outlet for easily. And since I do pay my bills by doing this, we still have a mortgage on our tiny condo that we live in Florida. There are those moments in which you have to actually say, okay, so I can't just keep doing this forever without finding somebody who's going to write a check, at least for an article. And it proves to be a high hurdle. There are very few outlets for us now in terms of gender critical outlets to think of places where we can publish with a wide audience. I can't do it in Newsweek or Time. I'm not really able to do it in the New York Times. I might get an occasional piece of the Journal as an op-ed. The Telegraph will cover it in the UK fairly well, but there aren't that many outlets.
Do you think our day will come, though? I keep thinking it should be here by now. I've been thinking that for years, but do you think our day is coming? Surely it is. Or will the scandal just pass and then nobody will have any interest?
No, because I think the scandal, the great thing is, and you both, have firm views on this, but I don't think the scandal, it's not like a light switch, unfortunately. So it's like the scandal's just over. I wish, I see so many people say, victory, they'll see the Supreme Court decision, or the one, the UK said, no, we're not going to, have puberty blockers, they're closing Tavistock. The swinging our direction. Look what's happening in Finland and Sweden. And I view that as, yes, it's good news. I'm happy to see it, but it's not like it's over, because there's money involved. There are trans activists. I'm not talking about the people on the street who are screaming to attack J.K. Rowling. I'm talking about the people who are able to write big checks for millions of dollars. The Pritzkers of the world, who have billions of dollars, who themselves have transitioned over and are ready now to take this and make it a part of the medical system. The medical schools that have added in courses on gender affirming, quote unquote, care because somebody's given a $20 million grant. The American Psychiatric Association has put out its first textbook that is essentially just a handbook for transing. None of those are going away. They aren't apologizing. They aren't changing over time. The people at the University of California, San Francisco, Jack Turpin and others who push the idea that this is just a minor setback for them. So in the future, with a different president who might be more sympathetic to the trans views, maybe it swings the other way. So I just don't think it's ever over. But I do think in terms, Mia, of what you asked, is there a moment at which the press coverage changes? Maybe it takes a writer who is completely trans-friendly at the moment, a major writer, to flip and change their mind. The opening of the free press, the very Weiss and that's all helped.
Jack Turpin.
Yeah.
I was thinking Jesse
you
single.
Turpin. Yeah, no.
But you mean like Jesse? Is Jesse single enough because he uses the pronouns, or is he too
Not enough?
cosmopolitan?
Yeah, no, not enough, I think. And and I have we have our own little differences on all those things. So I look at Jesse using the pronouns, or as sometimes, and I think to myself, okay, so I don't agree with using pronouns, because I go back all the time. I'm sorry to jump around on this, but I try to say to people who use the pronouns, who think they're being kind, who think that's a nice thing to do, and I say, do you realize that even I love this saying, oh my God, even the original Dutch creators of the crazy idea of puberty blockers back in the 90s, the late 90s, those Dutch researchers, who were also partly paid on their original study by a European pharmaceutical company that had a puberty blocker, but that's aside, that always happens. But those Dutch researchers who believed in puberty blockers, who thought there was a worthwhile thing to do, which is absolutely madness, even they said, by the way, don't do any social transition. Don't call them by the pronouns that they want. Don't dress them in the dress of the gender they think they want to move to. Don't do any of that, because if you do any social transitioning, you're going to push them into the pipeline too quickly. You're really not going to know whether, in fact, they should have puberty blockers or whether they should not. Even they realized that was a fast track, sort of was making it quicker to go in. Once you start to say to the child who thinks they want to be called by different pronouns for that, and you live up to that, you're reinforcing this fake belief that there's a choice here in some ways. And so I don't think you're being kind or politically correct or anything else by using pronouns. I actually think you're potentially doing harm by doing that, because you're feeding a false tenet that there's some binary choice down the road that you can make that comes down to something as simple as pronouns.
Yeah.
I would say that most people in our own field who are using pronouns, they're not using them to be kind, even if they say they are. They're using them to be strategic. And I would question their strategy, but I think that's actually, when you actually talk to them over a drink at night, that's actually why they use it. That's my reasoning, or certainly my understanding. But I do want to talk a little bit, I wasn't anything like as prestigious or as eminent as you, but I had certainly had my reputation in Ireland, and it was very solid. And so my cancellation was very slow as a result, because everybody knew me. They knew my politics. They knew my, anybody who was following mental health. I not everybody knew me nowhere near, but you know what I mean? Like, I had my position. And so the cancellation was very slow. Like you say, you'd be thinking, am I getting no because this is trans, or because I've just been talking about trans? It was very subtle, but it was way back, and we're talking 2018, 2019, 2020. I would say for you now, we're in a warmer atmosphere. There's a much more legitimacy to our side. So I'd hope that you won't get that slow cancellation, that you're getting touches of it, probably. I think both of us would presume that, but that there will be a feeling of there seems to be another side that is getting an awful lot of attention. What I'd be interested in is the other journalists. Are they telling you to stay away from it? What the other journalists who must know? Journalists are supposed to go towards the story.
Yeah.
What are they saying to you?
The journalists who work for magazines, and I talked to a number of them, who are getting a check by working at a large newspaper or a large magazine. They have to get it assigned by an editor, and they're not fighting to get it assigned because they don't think it'll go up the flagpole. So they're not making any effort to fight for it. One of the most aggravating things, personally, is when I have a beer with somebody. They're visiting town. They're in Miami. We get a chance to go out. We catch up on the sorry state of journalism and whatever else, and how we pay has gone down for writing per word or whatever else. And then we get around story ideas, and they will say, often on trans, oh, I agree with that. I think it's terrible what's happening, but they won't write about it. It's the same thing that you have, like when you talk to somebody off the record, and the off the record conversation really doesn't help, because silence in this field, when you have the ability to use the pen, you have the ability to have an outlet, is something. Now, aside from those journalists who are getting a salary, so they're worried about their positions, there are freelancers who I think could be going after this as a real story, and they're not quite sure how to. I mean, even on cases that seem to me so clear-cut, and I did not end up writing about this, but there's a doctor in Texas, so well, Dr. Hyam, who had been a whistleblower on continuing work at a Texas hospital after Texas has passed a law that said no more surgeries on children under the age of 18. And he said, by the way, they're still doing it over here. And then the federal government came in, they sort of arrested him, and they said, oh, you have really crossed the line, legal line. You have released confidential information that violates HIPAA. Forget about the fact that he might be saving some child that's about to, have their life altered from surgery. So I thought journalists would rush to that, as there were a lot of journalists who covered Justice Department, the courts. They did not at all. And I would sort of, send them the information about the case, thinking it was perfect for them to write about. But the trans part kept them away from it, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's truly a catastrophic failing on the part of the entire journalist profession, because you're right, this is exactly the type of story that they should be all over. And I think, when we got those emails, the discovery emails in the Alabama case with WPATH, and this whole story about how Admiral Rachel Levine was in there pressuring WPATH to get rid of the minimum age requirements and stuff. That's a huge story. That is the Biden administration interfering in the standards of care that are going to be used internationally for an entire field of medicine, where children are being chemically castrated, having body parts chopped off, or adolescents having body parts chopped off. It's an enormous story, and who touched it? No one touched it. But I will say that I got my entire brand new career by by writing about this issue. So I'm kind of on the flip side of you guys.
Yeah, no, that's right. When you broke with Public and Michael Schellenberger, you broke WPATH. Michael was kind enough to let me look at the files beforehand, and I was able to write a piece in the New York Post. But then you're so right on this, Mia. To me, WPATH is a story that is a major story that you have the people inside this organization that's being used by, trans and everywhere else, right? Ideal. But then the bigger part of that becomes that the Assistant Secretary of, Health and Human Services inside the Biden administration themselves transitioned over is interfering in this organization and asking for changes. And by the way, that on its own should be front page news in the New York Times, but not asking for changes to make the guidelines more conservative, not asking for guidelines to say, slow up here. You're a little too fast at WPATH. I'm not quite sure the science has caught up to what you're recommending about Unix and others. Why don't we slow up just a touch and decide? This is the interference to actually say, why don't we take the age restrictions off? Forget about that 15 and 16. Just take them off and let each doctor decide as they do it. And that should be a story that you would think would lead to calls for resignation of Rachel Levine. And I didn't even see Republicans in the government use that to say, I think that, Dr. Levine has overstepped the bounds of what a government official should do. This is really terrible. And it's frustrating because time and time again, I can only imagine for you, Jen Specht, and Mia, you seeing this and writing about it and doing the podcast. I know how frustrating it is for me when I think a story breaks and I say, that's it. That's the one that's going to go everywhere because it crosses.
Yeah.
It is about trans, but it's about government interference and big government and no science. And no matter how many times we say, follow the science, no one is here. And it doesn't happen yet.
Yeah. Have you kind of got much with the follow the money track? Because it often feels like it's the least explored aspect of this multifaceted issue. I really feel we've really delved into the science, our side, really penetrated it. We've really penetrated the kind of the psychology, the impact of the hormones and the impact of surgery. By the way, we're going to do some great talks on that in the conference in Albuquerque. You should be there, Gerald.
We must gotta find a way to get by there.
We'll send you a media pass. But I don't think the follow the money thing has been. It's sitting there like a duck waiting. I really feel it should be explored much more deeply.
So I think that it seemed to me follow the money is always it's a never lose proposition for an investigative journalist on any given field you're looking at, as a practical matter. Even right now in the States, with the Supreme Court is considering whether parents in Maryland can opt out of having their children look at very explicit books, Eyes for Intersex, things like this, given to 3 to 5 year olds. Well, one of the things that nobody's talked about, and Trish and I were just discussing this the other day, yes, there are some real gender activists, trans activists who want these books before the eyes of kids. But the school district also gets paid based upon a formula of how many kids show up at class. So if kids opt out, if you have 20% opt out, they don't get the same money. Remember, follow the money. So some of it is is money as well. And I always say that. And in terms of the trans, I really do believe in an overarching sense, the devil's in the details. But after the success in getting same-sex marriage passed, the large organizations like Human Rights Committee, HRC and others, they were left without a cause for a moment. It fought for this, and they had a lot of funding that came in from people who really thought we need to have same-sex marriage. It's time, it's a right, and that drove a lot of fundraising and gave them a mission. And afterwards, they really didn't have that. And it wasn't as though they jumped to trans right away, but trans sort of started to fill the coffers as an issue over a period of a few years and became a rallying point as trans rights, quote unquote, became an issue. And it is certainly a fundraising mechanism for some of the largest organizations. The difficulty in writing about the money pipeline for trans is that gifts, large gifts, are made, let's say, to an LGBT group. And it's very hard to parse out how much of that went to trans issues. So somebody will give a $10 million gift. It goes, in fact, now you have to get inside the organization to find out where they used it, how they used it. They're not always, I've done my equivalent of freedom of information requests to some of these organizations, and they just smell something's rotten in the state of Denmark the minute I'm writing to them. So it's hard to figure out. I try to figure out exactly how much has gone to trans, even on cases in which something is done like Pritzker wrote a $25 million check to the University of San Francisco for an additional wing of the medical center, which is focusing a lot on trans youth issues, but not all of it. Some is going to all types of other issues. So, I wish I could say to you, $4.2 billion went in the last 5 years to trans issues from 100 of the wealthiest people in the U.S. You can't quite break it out like that. It takes some real detective work to do, and I think that, as you both know, this is not a situation in which money is the driving factor for the real ideologues. The real believers, the hardcore believers, are not driven by money. But what I like to say is, if you get a trans activist, if you get people like the surgeons, the doctors, the others who really believe it in their heart and core that, you're trapped in the wrong body and we're going to change all of this. There are other industries like pharma who look at it and say they aren't real ideologues, but they're willing to make money off of it. So you mean there's billions of dollars in this business? We're in. And that's it. Medical devices, the people, that's all coming in. The schools, the big schools that are looking to create a curriculum, the textbook manufacturers, they're looking to cash in, and that then feeds the underlying trans ideology.
Right. This brings me to, I wanted to ask you said something earlier about how the pharmaceutical industry, they love the lifelong patients. They love to get them young and get them on a lifelong track. And now I tend to always say that I don't believe money is the driving force behind this. Like you just said, I think it's ideological first and foremost, and it's true believers on a quest to save all of these kids and all of these people with mismatched gender souls. How much influence do you think, like it was Ferring Pharmaceuticals who sponsored the Dutch paper, the Dutch conference in the early days? How much influence do you think the pharmaceutical industry has on this particular scandal?
So I think the scandal would be taking place even if the pharmaceutical industry was not there pressing on the gas, if that makes sense. It just is that it moves at maybe a faster speed. So Ferring Pharmaceuticals had not backed the Dutch researchers. Would the Dutch researchers have still found a way, maybe have got an academic grant, maybe got a grant from the government, found a way to cobble it together and still do the study that they thought was going to be groundbreaking? Yes. And Ferring maybe made it easier for them. So I think that, look at a lot of the doctors at the hospitals that are doing the most in terms of trans surgeries. They have studies that they're throwing up against the wall, and they like it when they get funding for that from a pharmaceutical company. But I think that it's there without the pharma sort of assistance.
I feel the pharma are sitting back just saying, say nothing. This is massive money so long as we say nothing. And once they say anything, it'll crash on them. You know what I mean? All they have to do is sit back and provide the pharmaceuticals, and they're going to be just cashing it.
Yes, I agree. But one of the things that's what's my dream list? I don't have a bucket list. I've never made a bucket list, I feel like, but I do have a dream list for things I'd like to do in different fields where I think there could be reforms. One of the things I always think of in terms of like very specific focus in terms of money, drugs, pharma, trans, is and the Trump administration could say RFK Jr., he's certainly unpredictable. I don't know what he's going to do on different things. He's no friend of pharma. So will they move to take away or limit or restrict the right of doctors in America, where there's the most profitable market, as prices are set at whatever the pharma companies want for the most part, to restrict their ability to do off-label dispensing? And they could, if they wanted to. I've even written to some Congress people and others in government, and I never even get a response. Your podcast may reach them. They could just say, guess what? You can't, as a physician, prescribe a medication for another use for those under the age of 18. We often have different rules for children, right? Because the drugs are approved almost always for adults. They're testing adults. And so the application to children, pediatric use and others, is something that's another hurdle off. Now, if you stop that, then that would mean that the drug companies would have to have a clinical trial to say that puberty blockers worked for gender dysphoria. And then the very concept of gender dysphoria could be fought before the FDA and the government. Then it would be open for scientific debate. That would open up a Pandora's box for them. They don't want that. I mean, AbbVie loves the fact that it has $4 billion a year in sales in Lupron, of which maybe $1 billion or $1.5 billion comes from off-label dispensing for puberty blockers. I think that's disgraceful myself. And why isn't the government stepping in to do something about that? What they don't, if you step in tomorrow as the government and say, by the way, we're stopping all off-label dispensing, you'll get people who say, doctors will say, we're using this particular drug that was originally designed for diabetes because I had 4 cancer patients with terminal stage 5 cancer on prostate cancer, and somehow it works for them to make them better. So you don't want to stop that type of experimentation. I understand if the patient's willing to do it. But let's say you block it for children under the age of 18, you then opened up the question of puberty blockers. Then are the drug companies going to go and actually try to get it approved? And if so, when I say we, not just the 3 of us, but everybody have the ability to actually present the evidence and fight it. I would love to see that.
Can we, this is sort of related then. Can we talk about opioids? I love your work on, actually, I don't know. Can we start with, I've heard you do this wonderful history of early pharma, how the pharmaceutical industry began, and it's all linked to opioids. And it's a kind of crazy, crazy history of the law of unintended consequences. Can we go there? Because I was obsessed for a while with the parallels between the opioid crisis and gender medicine. I think there are really, really strong parallels. So can you give us a history first?
Yeah, I mean...
could I just add, I totally agree with you, Mia, that the history of pharma, which you're going to tell us, Gerald, and then it builds into almost a crescendo of the opioid crisis. And then to me, cherry on the cake, in comes trans to kind of one up the actual opioid crisis. And it's like there's a golden thread. Yeah. It seems to me anyway.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, the limitation on trans, as I'm starting at the end and then I'll go back to sort of the beginning, is that from pharma, it's just the cold calculus of sitting around a table in marketing and the board of directors at a big pharma company. What you want are patients who are chronically ill, or they have to take medication for life, antidepressants, whatever else. They're going to be there forever. You don't want to spend $1 billion developing an antibiotic that somebody takes for 3 to 5 days or 7 days, and then that's the end of it. And only when they're very sick, you'd rather develop a drug people are going to take all the time. And you want big numbers. So heart medication is fantastic. A lot of people, heart disease, diabetes, fantastic. Weight loss drugs. Oh my God, what a home run. Anxiety, all of those things. So trans is still small in terms of the numbers. I don't mean to minimize the ones it's happening to, but it's not as though it's happening at scale yet, right? That's one. But back to the beginning of an industry that I believe is just built in terms of money. So it really starts around 1900 when there are no real drugs because doctors, they don't know much. There's no American Medical Association. There's no nothing. They don't know much about drugs. There are only these things called patent medicines, which really are sort of fake elixirs and everything else that are put together. The one drug that they knew that did work in the middle of the 1800s on was morphine. They had morphine discovered, and that was fantastic. And it was used heavily in the American Civil War because although it couldn't save a life, it would stop somebody from suffering so much. So morphine on the battlefield. And what happened? There was such a demand for morphine that people were making counterfeit morphine and all. So a few companies said, a few people in their garages in Brooklyn, New York, and things like that said, we can make quality morphine. And they got their start. And that's how Pfizer started, and that's how Lilly started, and that's how, it's so fantastic. Some of the biggest drug companies around get their start in the wake of the morphine production, and they do it. And in 1899 to 1900, my favorite is you have all these fake drugs out there, and one company is ahead of the game, and that's Bayer. We think of Bayer aspirin. And Bayer has a scientific team that is head of the rest of the drug industry. And over a 5-year period, they developed 5 different drugs. They find, first of all, acetaminophen, paracetamol, right? Tylenol. That's their first real discovery. And then they end up finding heroin, which they actually market as the brand name heroin from the German heroic, because they market it as a cure for morphine addiction. I'm not kidding you. It's true. Well, it will cure your morphine addiction. You won't use morphine anymore. Right. And also for overactive children, it's in elixirs and everything else. There are no prescriptions, by the way, needed at this time. You walk into a store and buy all of this. So there's no prescription, no FDA, nothing at all. And so they're able to put that out, and it's pretty fabulous. And then they end up finding their paracetamol. They've already come up with that. Then they come up with the first barbiturate, which is theirs. And they put that out. And so they're phenobarbital. They're pretty amazing over a period of time. The only drug that they actually didn't put to market was paracetamol because they decided that was too toxic. But heroin and everything else they marketed. And finally, the drug addiction in the United States was so much, there were so many drug addicts that in 1906, we passed a law called Food and Drug Act, which for the first time regulated foods and drugs to some extent. And then in 1914, the government passed the Harrison Act, which banned the importation of opioids and all of those types of drugs. So the drug industry, which was just starting out, which was basically selling addictive drugs, all morphine-based products or these elixirs, was left without any products because they were told that they couldn't use their morphine anymore. It was now verboten. They also had a list on the front of the bottle what was in it. Before that, you didn't have to say what was in the drug. And the only drug that's really discovered during all this time is around 1921 incident discovered by a couple of Canadian researchers. Really a breakthrough discovery. And to teach those Canadian researchers how the American drug industry works, Lilly says, hey, can we get the distribution rights to that drug? We'll make it big. And they got it. They tied it up exclusively. They had it for 45 years. Uh-huh. They used it. Lilly taught the rest of the drug industry how you could lock up a drug and make a fortune from it. And then the whole industry changes essentially in World War II because they discover a real drug, penicillin, fantastic, from British researchers, of course. And they put it on a crash program, World War II. The Brits come over to the U.S. They say to the U.S., hey, you want to spend the money to make this into a real deal? U.S. government gets behind it, says, oh, God, this could save lives on the battlefield and everything else. Again, it's a war, just like morphine was for the Civil War. And this time, they spend millions and millions of dollars. They ask drug companies to get involved, and these drug companies come forward, and we, the U.S. government, build for them enormous manufacturing plants with distilleries and everything else to make the penicillin. And the agreement was, as opposed to COVID, when we gave them all this money years later and they were able to keep the patent and make money on it, this time in penicillin, they were told, guess what? Nobody owns the patent. We give you the money. You're going to create these great manufacturing facilities. You're going to manufacture it and get it out. And you're going to save lives. And they said, okay, we'll do it. And the 10 companies that got involved are still the 10 largest drug companies in the United States for like 50 years afterwards. It was their start. So the price of penicillin dropped to near zero after the war because nobody owned the rights to it. But they all had the technology of how to make it. And what they did is they went off and then did research to come up with variations of antibiotics. So they came up with tetracycline. They came up with other drugs that were just a molecule or two different. And the U.S. government gave each one its own patent, so long as it had a different dosing or therapeutic dosage. And the 1950s was the age of antibiotics. They all made money on it. And as a result, we have antibiotic resistance today because everybody was taking antibiotics for sniffles and everything else. And so created it. And one guy, there was a family called the Sackler brothers. They were three psychiatrist brothers. Yeah. And one of them had a small advertising business. And he went to a company that was then putting out its own antibiotic. And they didn't have a very good antibiotic. They really couldn't make a case for why their antibiotic should be chosen over anybody else. And he said, if you give me $10 million for an advertising budget, I can sell that drug. And they did. And he launched the first team of drug representatives going to doctors to try to convince them, taking them to dinner, running ads and everything else. And he created essentially a drug that became the number one selling antibiotic in the country. And as a result, Hoffmann La Roche in Switzerland hired him to do the marketing for Librium and Valium. And those became the drugs of the 60s. So Valium, the number one drug in the world for 15 years, thanks to Arthur Sackler's marketing. And that's the drug industry. They chase whatever's making money. In the 50s, it's antibiotics. In the 60s and 70s, it is anti-anxiety drugs and tranquilizers, sold also primarily to women. Women marketed as the test market because men needed Valium to be able to be better breadwinners, to go to work and not get an ulcer. Women needed it because they were hysterical and they wouldn't do housework well unless they had a combination of Ritalin and Valium. And I kid you not, the ads for the big drug companies, some of which I produced in the book, are startling in terms of their misogyny and sexism. And they were run and people paid money for it. And doctors, who were almost all men at the time, 2/3 of the prescriptions were written for women. So that's the 60s and 70s. And then there were also diet pills, methamphetamine, essentially speed. Diet centers opened up all over the U.S., just like the opioid center did later. And that became, and then finally what has happened, the government comes in and cracks down. So HRT, hormone replacement, big because a doctor in New York was subsidized by a company who was making it and wrote a book called Feminine Forever, in which he said, if you go through menopause and you don't take hormones, artificial hormones from the companies that are making it, you will shrivel up. You won't be sexy. You'll lose your femininity. You'll be old. My mother went through through menopause, and she was made into, a vestige, a wasted woman. She changed her life as a result of taking hormones. After 10 years of increased rates of breast cancer and endometrial cancer caused by hormone rates that were way too high in the original pill and HRT, did we find out that that doctor was subsidized by the company that produced the pill. He was paid his office to book everything he put out. His own wife got breast cancer, which the second time when it turned out to be terminal, but they kept it a secret because they thought it would be bad for business. That's the drug industry that should not surprise you when it takes you into the opioid crisis. Sorry, because when the opioid crisis starts in the sense of a British doctor who has created hospice, essentially, one of the heroes of the story in many ways for me, told you can only be, oh yes, Cicely Saunders, as Tricia says in the background. Yep. Cicely Saunders, love this, by the way, one last thing, sorry. A woman who is a nurse and says to a doctor, I think it's terrible inside terminally ill cancer wards, seeing people die and they can't go home. They can't go home because they're given pain medication every 4 to 6 hours. She says to a doctor, it would be great if we were able to find a pharmaceutical company that could develop a pain reliever that lasted a long time, maybe all day, so they could go home. He said, no one's going to listen to you. You're a nurse. They won't listen to you unless you're a doctor. So she went to medical school and became a doctor. I love that. And then she established the first a hospice at St. Christopher's. And she was looking for a drug company that could come up with a long-acting opioid. And she found one in a small drug company owned by the Sackler brothers. A British drug company developed a drug that could deliver morphine every 12 hours. And that became the ability to expand hospice. The Sacklers took that idea. They marketed the drug in America, didn't sell. But they said, you know what? We need a drug other than morphine. That has a terrible reputation among the public. So they came up with oxycodone. They mixed that into a long-acting pill. They got the approval from the FDA in 1996 to put it out as a drug that would be less likely to cause dependence because you weren't using it every 4 hours, only every 12 hours. And it was eventually dispensed like candy. And we created in the United States through doctors, just like the doctors who are butchering children today under the trans banner, doctors were dispensing opioids like there was no harm to them, creating habits, killing 100,000 people a year. The Sacklers, meanwhile, became billionaires, one of the wealthiest families in all of America. And as I say in my book, Pharma, it's one of the most disgraceful stories in not just American pharmaceutical industry, but in American history that we allowed it to happen for so long. We are reactive to these things, and that's how we are now on trend. So I'm sorry for that very long history.
No, that was great.
Pharma.
That's
but why I have so little faith in the drug industry doing the right thing.
Can I ask about Russell Portnoy? Do you know much about him? Because to me, he's kind of the villain. He was on something of he was the pain as the fifth vital sign guy, and he was based on a study, a very flawed, not really a study, but just a paper, very few patients. He determined that nobody gets addicted. Less than 1% get addicted. When I'm looking at parallels, I think this man was on this quest. Less than 1% get addicted to opioids, and I just think it's our less than 1% regret rate that everybody's pushing now. It's obviously blatantly nonsense, and yet he was the guy, was he not, who pushed this into the mainstream?
You're right, but I was looking over to the side because I have a book from his that came out just around the time that OxyContin went on the market, written with another doctor about pain, and the book is actually quite sober. The book has caveats built in. It's an academic book as to the limitations of the studies, what they might show, the need for additional studies. And two things happened. The Sacklers took that book and those studies, and they publicized them and sold them in meetings to doctors without the caveats. They said, oh, by the way, look at that, less than 1% get addicted when they are given opioids. Now, you know what that was actually? 30,000 people were looked at in a hospital who had been confined to a hospital for some type of surgical procedure. At some point, that 30,000 had been given an opioid one time or more while in the hospital for pain. They then followed up with them afterwards to see if any were addicts, and they found fewer than 1%. So it turns out that if you're in a hospital setting for 5 days, you're dispensed an opioid, and then you're released, and you're not already a drug addict, you may not have a high rate of addiction. It had nothing to do with what the real rate of addiction is. If you're given opioids regularly for things like back pain and osteoarthritis and everything else that was being prescribed for. So the Sacklers pushed that out. But the problem with Portnoy is the following. Here's where he crossed the line. So here's a doctor who did his work. He was one of these enthusiastic advocates for the idea that opioids had been unfairly tarnished, tar and feathered for decades as being too addictive. There was a reanalysis taking place among some physicians that really, if you gave opioids for pain, it wouldn't be addictive. That's madness. It's wrong. We know that now, that anybody can become addicted to them, no matter even if it's for a good cause like pain. You have to give them very, very sparingly and in only cases of real breakthrough pain. But these doctors thought of themselves at the forefront. They eventually became funded by the drug industry, by the Sacklers and others. At that point, they should have drawn back. Portnoy did not. And he then became a real advocate for it. He went on to popular shows in America, talking about it in a generic sense on Good Morning America and others. He became a spokesperson. He was paid to go on the Speakers Bureau for Purdue and others. And that's where you see somebody go from the book that I read, in which he's still a physician, talking to other physicians about here's the risk, here's what we don't know, but here's why I think we should do more study. to becoming a cheerleader for it. And that's where you've lost all of your credibility as a physician. And the cheerleaders on trans, and we see them, the Jack Turbins and others of the world, they have lost all credibility in my mind. I see them cited time and time again because they are advocates now. They are no longer scientists and doctors in that sense.
Yeah, I always think about the motivations. Like, you're right, they've gone way off the track, they've gone way off the rails, but I think they think their motivations are pure. I think Portnoy, he all along was on a quest to ease suffering. It was a war on pain. He wanted to help people and he wanted to end people's suffering, which is the same as your turban and all of the gender clinicians now. They're on a quest. They really think that they're easing suffering when they're causing so much pain, just like Portnoy did.
You know me, it's very interesting you say that, because what I want doesn't really matter. But what I would like is, I always think to myself, oh, wouldn't it be great then if someone like Portnoy, and I tried to interview him for the book, I didn't get an answer from him. The reason I didn't get an answer, I didn't expect, he had been named in lawsuits. In all the litigation filed against the Sacklers and Purdue and everything else, he was named as a key opinion influencer, one of those people who would influence the industry to move toward that. So he'd been named in these suits. So the chance that he was going to talk to a journalist doing a book about the pharmaceutical industry was slim and nil. But still, I tried. I always try everybody. They can always say no. But I'm waiting for the moment in which they have that, come to Jesus moment, or that in which they say, and I'm not a religious person, but, you hear that term in which they say, I now realize how wrong I was. I now realize that although my intent was good, and I thought the idea was good in alleviating pain, the way this was used, the way it became so popularized, the way doctors overprescribed, the way drug industries pushed it, that I wish I had seen that 10 years earlier. I made a mistake. They can't say that. They're worried about litigation. They're worried about whatever's left of their prestige or that, and they can't do it.
Yeah, I know. Well, he's one of the ones. When I was looking, I'm always looking at, are we ever going to get that? Are we ever going to get these gender clinician surgeons saying, I'm sorry, I made a terrible mistake? And he, in 2012, I remember he came out and said something like, we didn't know then what we know now. That was his apology. It wasn't, I should never have done what I did. I've caused terrible harm. No, there was none of that. There was no accepting blame. It was simply we didn't know. But I think that's such a cop-out, and I don't know why we let him get away with it, because sure, we didn't know then what we know now, but you at the very least knew that you had no evidence. You at the very least knew that you were unleashing this really powerful drug, wide mainstream, based on no science. You should have known that at the very least.
At the very least, and the 2012 statement, by the way, is really, when you look at this period that was going on, he continued to give speeches and make money afterwards, is an attempt by him to say, if we knew, then what we know now. He was complaining about the fact that there were these pill mill doctors who essentially established businesses that were just giving pills out all the time. He still had some inkling to try to defend the idea that if it was dispensed in the way that he thought it should be dispensed, with 1,000 Portnoys around the country, or that, he could clone himself. And they wouldn't be giving it at 3:00 in the morning, to people driving up on a drive-in and like somewhere in Baton Rouge or that, where essentially it was just a legal drug outlet, that it might be better. So his problem was with the way that it had been overpopularized, but not with the underlying concept. And one of the things I think about this is, Portnoy was asking for, and others, these clinical trials. And people don't realize, I think, and if you don't study the drug industry, you have no reason to know it, the average person thinks that if something's been approved in the NHS as safe for drug dispensing, or it's been approved here in the United States by the Food and Drug Administration as being safe, that clinical trials were done and presented to those authorities to convince them that the drug did what it was supposed to do, what it claimed it was supposed to do, and is generally safe. And actually, it's within a range. So that, for instance, when they were doing the test for OxyContin, they really wanted to be able to say that it was 12 hours, because that was much better dispensing than saying every 4 or 6. And almost half of the subjects that they used it on in Puerto Rico, by the way, they didn't do the test in Manhattan or Palm Beach or someplace like that. They went off to Puerto Rico to do it. There are always picky spots to do it where, someone's disadvantaged and might be willing to join the trial. They still had almost half of the people had shorter periods of, pain relief. But as long as you have 50% or more, the FDA says that's fine. We'll do a majority vote. That's good enough for us. So things get through that always don't have it. But the clinical trials that Portnoy and others wanted at least would have taken a group of people, let's say with pain, fibromyalgia, some condition in which you had a chronic condition of pain, would have put some on a sugar pill and others on a real opioid. And then over a period of 4 or 5 months, determine if there's pain relief, is there intolerances built up, do you need more, are you have side effects of constipation, everything else with the opioid people, are they addicted? What type of trial do you do for children, for trans? You can't. We're doing it in real time right now by having parents afraid to say no because they've been fed the lie that, if you don't do it, the child's going to kill themselves. That lie is repeated all the time. And we have the health system paying for it. Health insurance is covering it. They don't want to be called transphobic. They'll cover it. I just did an article recently about the policies inside the largest financial brokerage company in America, Edward Jones, in which they cover the surgeries and the hormone treatments for children of their employees. But they define it not just as biological children, adopted children, children you have custody of, children that you're responsible for. It's a long list. So we're paying for it. We're having children in charge of making the decision because it's gender affirming. And then you're going ahead and going through the process. And this is the experiment. It's madness to me. You couldn't devise an experiment because it would be considered so Dr. Mengele-like. But instead, we're doing it in real time and subsidizing it. Sorry for that rant, but
yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're coming up towards the end. I'm sure Mia has one or two last questions, but what I would like to hear is where you think we need to go with the pharmaceutical industry, with the medical industry, because it feels so out of control. There's two kind of phrases that I think are leading the way that are very dangerous. One is informed consent and the other is the child-led. You know what I mean? When it's child-led and it's informed consent, we've got a disaster on our hands. But informed consent is effectively buyer beware. It's consumer healthcare. And for ourselves, let's say in GenSpec, we've taken the position that this isn't, medical transition. It's not healthcare. It's a failed medical intervention that has bad long-term outcomes, and that it might have a place in extreme body modification clinics. You know what I mean? As in, people have the individual right to choose their modifications. However, this isn't a healthy option. There's more healthy options that would actually lead to much better outcomes, significantly healthier outcomes. Where do you think we're going as the medical field continues to almost take over the world? It's really got an extraordinary amount of power. Is informed consent something that is inevitably here to stay, and that's where we have to lean into? Is that it? Like, can we forget about the old way, the doctor expertise? It's going to be informed consent.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, and I guess I look at this in part as a lawyer as well, although I don't practice, right? My legal head is on. Informed consent is the name of the game today, so we have to deal with it. Whether it is forever or not, you have to deal it and confront and try to make inroads on informed consent, which I believe when it comes to children, by the way, and I've had conversations with any number of psychologists and psychiatrists about the unformed brain before 25, the fact that teens do not have the ability, minors don't have the understanding of real long-term risk. They don't appreciate what that means. They can't understand something as a never-ending consequence. All those reasons why you can't have informed consent when it comes to something as drastic as amputation and body modification that has lifelong consequences. So the idea that you could have informed consent from a child on something like this is itself, on its face, actually preposterous. then the question becomes, of course, you get the guardian or the parents who provide the informed consent. And that is where I believe, again, if I was going to ask for help from governments or from the medical divisions, I would ask for what I call an informed consent required for children for a medical surgical procedure that was not life-saving. So you're not taken in with a burst appendix or from an accident scene where two cars have crashed, in which therefore they're going to do the surgery right away. You're talking essentially about, a voluntary surgery. You're making the choice for that. The standard for that should be higher than what it is for an adult. It should, now you think it's the opposite. It should be a more rigorous standard that requires a different level to be met. And the reason I say that is because then we get to debate the idea of gender affirming. It brings that up in terms of the medical standard. They have to confront it again. I'm trying to find some way so that gender affirming and the concept of that can be challenged before, when I think of America, the HHS, the FDA, the American Medical Association, and so I'll work within the system you've given me. It's informed consent, but I really think that we are doing a great disservice by not having a more rigorous form of informed consent and a higher standard to be met when it comes to children who are making a voluntary decision to have life-altering surgeries. And I don't want you to think that it's so true, because if you listen to me, you'll think I'm only concerned about people under 18, and everybody else can just go off and do what they want. And then, by the way, trans must be real once you're 19 or that, and no, I understand that. Nobody's born in the wrong body. I get that, and I understand, but I'm particularly, the reason I guess that I'm so focused, or try to stay often focused on those under 18, is, to me, that seems like a no-brainer. It's not to many people, but that's low-hanging fruit. When I talk to other journalists or people that don't want to get involved or they don't want to write about it, I try to focus on the under 18, the WPATH things like that, because otherwise you're going to get into the debate becomes more complex. They'll say, well, so I will debate that with them all day long about trans adults and children, but I often focus on the children because I think to myself, I can't even get you infuriated, upset, up in arms, or motivated to do something about what is happening to children in trans. I'm certainly not going to get you interested, motivated, or upset to do something about what adults are doing.
True. Okay, I do have tons of more questions, but I can't go there because they'll all take too long, and we're coming to the end. So
And I do give long answers. I'm sorry.
Oh, good. I love the long answers. I think my last question then is going to be, I think you already talked about it at the beginning. I've said so many times that I think there is an end. For the child side of it, I can see the end. I just really think it's in sight. It might not be easy and it's going to be messy, but I just think pediatric gender medicine, the end is in sight, and it just must come to an end because it's such an egregious crime. And then for adults, it's more messy. It's more difficult to see. I'm not even sure we'll ever get there. But do you see an end for pediatric gender medicine at the very least?
I hope so. I'm the reason I hesitate is because I have a relative cousin who went through gender procedures a number of years ago as a teen, and grew up and lived in California. So a lot of the work that I do is focused on California. And there, the reason I hesitate is because I know that at schools, when you announce that you identify as different gender, at schools outside of San Francisco where I grew up, everybody supports the decision. Nobody pushes back. The students, teachers, everybody else. You're told time and time again, you're brave. What a brave choice. Parents are told you're brave. Thank you for having the courage to allow your daughter or son to realize that they need to be. And so that hasn't flowed at all. I know that. And until that starts to change, in part, you can't just think pediatric transitioning will stop until we start to get parents to understand that it's not, they are doing the wrong thing by acquiescing and going along. The right thing is to question, to challenge, and to find out in a different way. But they often feel in these very progressive areas, like in California, that to do so marks them as somehow a religious conservative, and they feel as though they're being chastised for not being progressive. And so I think the answer is yes. I agree with you, but I don't think it's going to happen quickly, unfortunately.
I don't want to give you the last word, but I just want to add this because it's positive and I like to end on a positive note. But anecdotally, and Canada, I see Canada as being rather like your blue states. We're completely, apart from Alberta, we've lost the plot. But on the medical side, there's no sign of it slowing down. On the cultural side, I would say there's really little sign of it slowing down. But all of the teachers that I talk to say hardly any kids now. They had a wave, a good stretch where every single year they had at least one trans-identified kid in their high school class, sometimes two, sometimes three, and now they're back to none, maybe one every now and again. So I think the social contagion in the youth population is dying out, and then the adults will have to catch up.
So yeah, that's fabulous. So I know at this one progressive school that I keep an eye on, that's an arts school, as a matter of fact, for the equivalent of 14 to 18-year-olds. The trend has been still 15% or thereabouts of a class, not identifying necessarily as trans, but the choice that seems to be popular right now is just non-binary. And I view that as a place marker. It's like these kids are saying, you know what, I'm just not going to go along with what my parents are saying about a binary choice here on sex. I don't know necessarily if I go over here, but I'm staking it out here. Okay, so I'm viewing that as a step back, right, from the days in which people were actually saying, no, I want to trans over this, but I still don't view it as enough yet here of a change at the school level. As long as gender choices are considered a form of rebellion or being cool or standing out, and it's embraced by colleagues, friends, and teachers and families, it's still difficult to totally win the fight.
I have a little different, I think it's because I have an Atlantic between you two and me, that for me, and I have Tigger-like disposition where I think everything is going to be great soon, which doesn't go well for me regularly. But I kind of think, pediatric transitions, that's over. Like, we've won that one. Now we have to get to the meat of it. However, in Europe, I really do think culturally, like you go, you meet somebody at the bus stop, wherever you go, that generally the consensus is pediatric transition is mad. That would be for me, like in the world. And I do think that I fear in America it's going to turn into this weird red-blue gun laws eternal argument, while over in Europe it's going to be, no, that was a really high-handed intervention that should never have taken place.
So that makes so much sense. And here's the great news. I loved this the other day. I just relish this. At the Supreme Court hearing that's taking place on, whether parents should be able to opt out on these very sexualized books, given it to, 3 to 6-year-olds. Not that the book should be banned. By the way, we're not talking about book banning. They used to have a right to opt out. So you don't want your child to go through that part of sex for icing or sex to everything else. Then the school district took it away. So now they're asking for the right to opt out. So in front of the Supreme Court, people go to rally when there's an abortion decision or whatever else. You get the pro-abortion people and people against abortion. And here were parents who were rallying for the Supreme Court to decide to give them the right to opt out. And among those parents were Christian fundamentalists and Muslim parents and Orthodox Jewish parents and atheist parents. I love this. Nothing can bring together in this polarized world Muslims, Jews, Christians, and atheists on the same side of an issue except for this. And I thought to myself, that's fantastic. There's an issue in which if that becomes the common sense, as opposed to just being the political class and the medical community pushing this fake ideology, if parents can take charge again, and I say this not being a parent, we don't have children. So, I say this with the perspective, though, of just how I view this. If parents can put themselves back in the position of saying, as the average person might thinking, this is madness, then we will make very fast progress.
That's a great place to end it.